Welcome back to part 2 of chapter 10, the chapter about climate. So this part of the discussion will be largely kind of a race through the various climate types, with me pausing on occasion to point out specific things. Tropical climates come in 3 flavors. There is the rainforest climate, rainy all year, hot and wet almost always. The tropical monsoon climates, which are basically rainy and hot half the year, never really all that cold though. And then the tropical savanna climates, which are only periodically rainy. The tropical rainforest climate is very special. It has a diurnal temperature range, meaning from day to night, that is actually greater than the annual temperature range, meaning the winter cold is or no less than the overnight low temperature. Typically in the rainforest there's very little vegetation cover on the ground, and for my money one of the most important things is all that rain makes for nutrient poor soils, which sort of dooms most of these areas to perpetual poverty because there is almost no ability to grow abundant crops without taking an enormous amount of space. So let's take a look at the climograph for this town that I cannot pronounce in Brazil. It has an average annual temperature of almost 80 degrees Fahrenheit and a year-round rainfall total of 114 degrees. The temperature range is only 4 degrees. So the coldest month subtracted from the hottest month of the year is only 4 months or 4 degrees difference. Notice that there is high rainfall, which are on these blue bars, every month of the year. Slightly more rainy in May than it is in its driest month, which is September. But still September is seeing 6 inches of rain a month, which is what we would get here in the San Fernando Valley during the course of an entire year. Tropical monsoon climates are the second of the 3 tropical climates that we see, and the book has picked Yangon, which is formerly known as Rangoon in Burma. It has enormous amount of rain also during the course of the year, 105 inches, which is nearly what they're getting in the rainforest of Brazil. But notice it all comes during just a few months during the year, and then during January, February, March, and April, and then December it's actually quite dry, less than 1 inch of rain a year. But when the winds shift and the rains come, then it really gets rainy. The temperature regime is not great. The temperature range is about 10 degrees over the course of the year, so it doesn't really get that cold. And it doesn't, it gets hot in terms of temperature, maybe 90, and it never gets cold. So the temperature range stays right through there. The tropical savanna climate, for some reason the book didn't provide us with a slide of this, looks a little different. It has the same sort of wet, dry pattern as the monsoonal areas. Really high rainfalls during April here in this instance, and then very low rainfall, again less than an inch through the dry season. Many of you have probably seen these sort of nature shows about Africa, various parts of the Serengeti plain where the rains come and then it's the dry sort of starving time. Again, very little variation in yearly climate in terms of temperature, a low of 72 and a high of maybe somewhere around 85 or something like that. They're similar, but they work differently in terms of why they happen. The mild winters of the mesothermal climates, meaning the mid-latitude climates, include the humid subtropical, that's the American Southeast, marine west coast, and that's northern coastal California all the way up through coastal Canada on the west coast. And then here in California, our Mediterranean dry summer climate. Here's the climograph for the humid subtropical, rainy more or less throughout the year, not huge amounts of rain, about half of what you're seeing in some of the rainforest areas, only about 50 inches of rain a year, and the average temperature is 63, so pretty warm. The range of temperature is 20 degrees, so that's greater than we were seeing in some of the tropical areas. It can get cold. It will occasionally have a freeze in these areas, an occasional ice storm, because the temperatures do get pretty low on occasion, and average 80 during the summer. There is a slightly hotter version of this, and particularly the monsoonal version of it you can find in China, where the rainfall amounts exceed what they do in the United States. You'll see that it's 77 inches here, but the temperature regime is similar in that highs in the 80s during the summer on average, and wintertime lows below 50. These areas also can get the occasional freeze or snow. One of the two things that both of these areas have in common is that the soils tend to be not really great for a number of reasons, and we will talk about those later. So these areas sometimes struggle with agricultural productivity as well. Here's another version of this, the humid subtropical, but it has the dry winter, and so we won't have to worry about too much of this, but this exaggerated difference in the wet and dry parts of the year. Marine West Coast, you definitely should know. This is what characterizes essentially the California coastal climate from about San Francisco north, and a little bit of Appalachia here, Bluefield, West Virginia. What you see is relatively rainy, 40 inches of rain a year. It can be far greater in, say, Seattle, but the temperature range is nearly freezing to freezing in the winter, but never really gets too hot in the summer, averaging at the hottest part of the year about 70 degrees. Rain more or less all year round, a little drier in the fall. Here in Southern California, from San Francisco southward, there's a Mediterranean climate. That word comes from the Mediterranean Sea, because many of the areas around the Mediterranean, Italy, Spain, Greece, Libya, Israel, have very similar temperature and climate regimes. It never gets all that cold, down to the 50s in the winter, and when it's up against the coast, never really all that hot, 70 degrees. So Los Angeles, especially the San Fernando Valley, doesn't quite fit into this perfectly, but it's close enough, and it's all that this book will talk about. We'll see just a little bit difference later. Rainy in the winter, very dry in the summer, with a total average precipitation of 22 inches. Now, here in the San Fernando Valley, we get hotter temperatures and lower precipitation. Here we have Sevilla, Spain, which is really quite similar to what you might find in, say, Monterey, California. In the American Midwest, we have a couple of versions of humid continental climate. A little bit further south, we have the hot summer climates, and then a little further north are the mild summer climates. So you could think of, say, Michigan versus Ohio, or even maybe down to Kentucky. Subarctic climates, cool summers, very cold winters, and those are more Canadian. Here's a humid continental with the hot summer. This is New York City. It can get really quite miserable in New York in the summer, average close to 80 degrees, and wintertime temperatures can dip below 32. So there's a very large temperature range and average precipitation throughout the year, close to 50 inches of rain, or 45 a year. The hot summer climates can also be found in a place like China. You see a similar temperature range here. A little less precipitation in this part of China than what you have in New York City, and a greater variation in rainfall amounts from winter or from summer to winter. Humid continental with the mild summer climates you would find in Moscow, perhaps northern Michigan, maybe Minnesota. The summers never quite get all that hot, getting about 70 degrees in the hottest part of the year, but temperatures falling well below freezing during the average winter months. Precipitation is not great, averaging about 25 inches of rain a year, but because it's so cool, the land actually doesn't need as much for farming. And then you have the subarctic cool summer, which I would focus on extremely cold winters. The summertime average for temperatures is usually only about 55 degrees, but some wintertime temperatures dipping below 10 below zero easily during the winter months. Average rainfall, or which much of it is snowfall, is low at around just 17 inches. And then just the kind of silly weather of the subarctic in Siberia, averaging summer temperatures about 60 degrees, but wintertime temperatures going off the charts at 40 below zero. This temperature range is the most extreme that we'll see among all of these areas. Because it's so cold, there isn't very much precipitation during the year, averaging less than 6 inches of rain. So in many ways, these areas are nearly desert-like in their conditions. But again, because they're so cold, they don't really require that much rain or snow because there's very little evaporation even in the summer. Associated with those climates are the tundra and polar climates. We won't spend much time talking about these because they don't really affect the United States all that much, except for Alaska. I'll just roll through these here. You're welcome to look at them more closely on your own. Again, pointing out that Antarctica, because it is so cold, is essentially a desert, receiving less than a few inches of rain a year, mostly in the form of snow. Dry climates, we will take a moment to talk about. Subtropical high pressure zones. They're the great ones that I've already mentioned, Sahara, the Kalahari, that sort of stuff. The one in the United States is the Colorado Desert and partly the Mojave Desert in Southern California. The Mojave is a rain-shadowed desert because it's on the backside of the Sierra Mountains. We also have a lot of what's called steppe climate, and the San Fernando Valley very well may be better categorized as that. Let's take a look at these. Here's a real desert, the Arabian Desert, less than 3 inches of rain a year total. Temperatures never getting really below 60 and it going right off the chart here at 100. Here what we might see more of in, say, California is something like Albuquerque, New Mexico, averages about 8 inches of rain a year, which is not very different than the San Fernando Valley. It can get much colder out there because it is actually at a higher elevation. So this would be more like a high desert like Palmdale or Lancaster. But in the summertime, these areas can be quite warm. This one not quite that warm. Australia has a climate that's also in many areas very similar to California. Very hot summers averaging over 80 degrees and mild winters, never much less than 50 degrees. And again, only about 17 inches of rain a year, which is actually more than we get here in Southern California. The cold steppe is similar to our climate here in Los Angeles, in the San Fernando Valley, in that there is very little rainfall. They have a far greater temperature range, and so these are the kind of things that you would find on the plains of Canada or out in Kazakhstan in this instance, or the Dakotas, or maybe parts of Montana. Here are the summary points for this chapter. You can look at them on your own.